continuing with the question, what is race? And segueing to what is gender. A reminder of the main issue using this helpful analogy from Spencer are racial categories like the category dingo, which is a biological category that has actual members. In other words, there are dingoes. Or are racial categories like the category dime, which is a social category that has actual members. In other words, there are dimes. Dime is a nice example, a nice clear example of a social category. If we found something on Mars that by a fluke was an exact physical replica of a dime, it wouldn't be a dime. In order for something to be a dime, it has to be part of a system of exchange which requires the existence of societies. Or, finally, are racial categories like the category dodo, a biological category which has no members. Of course, that's not a perfect analogy because there were dodos. Dodos are just extinct. The corresponding position for race is that there aren't and never were any Asians, Pacific Islanders, and so on. And a reminder of the main positions, Appier's position, or at any rate a simplified version of Appier's position. Racial categories are empty biological categories like the category mermaid. There are no mermaids, so similarly, there are no Asians, or blacks, or whites, or Pacific Islanders. Spencer's view, racial categories are biological categories that have members. Specifically, those categories are human continental populations. And Sally Haslanger's view, racial categories are not biological, they are social. Well, maybe they're social, but the important point is that we should use racial vocabulary to pick out social categories. That might involve changing the meanings of our words. More about Haslanger's view later. Spencer discusses a well-known paper by Rosenberg and colleagues, so I thought it would be helpful to say a little bit about it. So we start with some DNA samples from about 1,000 people from 52 indigenous populations worldwide, taken from something called the Human Genome Diversity Cell Line Panel. We then assume that these people are descended from some number of ancestral groups or clusters. We'll call that number K. And the structure, program, or algorithm, in effect, estimates for each person the proportion of their genome that was inherited from these K groups. And at the top, you're looking at the result for K equals 2. Each thin vertical line represents a person, and orange and purple represent the two assumed ancestral groups. So for one person over here from East Asia, you can see that he or she has, that's his or her line, has 60% ancestry from the first cluster, approximately, and 40% from the second orange cluster. You can't interpret the orange and purple clusters as two real ancestral populations from which we're all descended. The Americans on the right are almost all purple, but humanity reached America last. Now, when K, the number of ancestral groups, is set to 5, we get this. Clusters that correspond to continents. And that's the result that Spencer uses. It's worth noting that the authors of this paper were quite careful in distancing themselves from any conclusions about race. Here's a quotation at the bottom from a later paper. Our evidence for clustering should not be taken as evidence of our support of any particular concept of biological race. This is a result for k equals 7, and using a different algorithm, there's a whole bunch of them. You can see that the Eurasian cluster gets split into 3, corresponding to the Middle East in brown, Europe in green, and Central and South Asia in the lighter blue. The sample was again from the Human Genome Diversity Cell Line Panel, and here the researchers analysed about 650,000 autosomal single nucleotide polymorphisms. Your autosome is that part of your genome in your chromosomes, excluding your sex chromosomes, so 22 out of your 23 chromosome pairs. And a single nucleotide polymorphism is a variation at a single DNA letter in the genome that occurs in at least 1% of the population or so. SNP is pronounced SNP. Here's an example of a SNP. Thomas, say, has a C in this position, while Kelly has an A. SNPs can be either in the 1 to 2% of your DNA, which contains protein coding sequences, or the other 98 to 99%, so-called non-coding DNA. They're actually more likely to occur at positions that are non-coding than at coding positions. So here's a Spencer-like template for a broadly biological account of race. Person S is American Indian or Asian, etc. If and only if S has some or greater than 50% or close to 100% or some other amount of genomic ancestry from the corresponding continental ancestral group. So that is an adjustable parameter in this template. Spencer himself sets it to some, but you might want to consider alternative settings. Spencer's argument, at least if we ignore the bit about human continental populations being real biological entities, which he argues for separately, can be put this way. Premise 1, races, or what Spencer calls folk races, the groups we ordinarily pick out with the words like Asian, black, and so on, are OMB races, races as defined by the US Office of Management and Budget. Premise 2, OMB races are human continental populations. This is where the work by Rosenberg and others comes in. Conclusion, races are human continental populations.